Welcome everyone. My name is Duncan Ivison. I'm the DVCR Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research here at the University of Sydney. It's my great pleasure to host the final panel discussion, and there is a veritable panoply of superstars on this panel. So I've got a tough job and we have a limited amount of time. I won't give the full academic introduction because I think that would take the entire workshop. If I summarized your careers, it would be over before we knew it. So I'll just briefly introduce our panelists this afternoon. The theme, obviously you've had a spectacular 2 days of discussions and presentations. So I guess the chance for us now is to bring it all together. So that is the challenge for my fellow panelists this afternoon. How do we kind of bring together some of the extraordinary presentations around this topic of what's next, a vision for brain and mind science. What is the future of brain and mind science? And just to get my panelists thinking as I'm introducing them, one thing that we're trying to do at the university, obviously, we're a big, comprehensive, research-intensive university with deep roots in a range of different communities. And we're trying to harness that research in new ways, in ways that not only address fundamental problems in science, in the humanities, in the social sciences, but also fundamental problems facing our communities, local, here in Redfern, national, here in Australia, global, regional. So how do we harness those extraordinary research resources in ways that actually tackle problems that matter deeply, not just to our staff and students, which is very important, our alumni, but also to the range of communities we serve. So, you know, that's a big task for a university like ours, but a very exciting one. And I think the Brain and Mind Center has been an absolute exemplar of that mission, that vision, that ambition of harnessing our research in new ways, and this time in relation to brain and mind science and all the things that you do. So I guess one thing I'm going to want our panelists to talk about in a minute is really thinking about that vision and then thinking about, in relation to your particular area, over the next 5 to 10 years, where do you think the greatest breakthrough is going to come? And who are you going to have to collaborate with? What disciplines are you going to need to enable those great breakthroughs to be delivered, to enable that next stage to be reached in relation to the great questions or the scientific challenges you're facing? So while you ponder that, I'll briefly introduce everyone. We've got Associate Professor Sebastian Gardner, who is sort of representing the Sebastian Rosenberg, sorry, who's representing the sort of mental wealth initiative. We've got Michael Barnett, computational neuroscience. We've got Associate Professor Fabienne Brilot-Turville, Neuro Immunology. Adam Guastella, who we just heard from in relation to child neurodevelopment. It was a terrific talk, Adam. We've got, I thought we were going to have Glenda. Is Glenda on the line? I can't see her, but if she's here, Glenda Halliday was going to...
Unable, Duncan.
Oh, okay, sorry.
I'm Glenda for the afternoon.
Muireann Irish is, well, you are yourself. You don't need to replace anyone. We've got Muireann. That's wonderful to have you, Muireann. Ian Hickie, of course, academic co-director of the BMC, Youth Mental Health and Technology. I think, is Matthew joining us for this panel? He was on my original list.
He's unavailable too.
Okay, no worries at all. And then, of course, Sharon Naismith, who's going to be talking to us from the perspective of sleep. So look, why don't I start with Sharon? And as I said, Sharon, you know, when you think about the role of multidisciplinary research, you know, in your area, in what way is that going to transform your discipline? And when you think about the next 5 to 10 years, what are the areas, the collaborations, what are the sort of edges of your discipline that are going to require new ways of thinking, new ways of posing questions, new experiments, new methods? Where's that going to come from? And what does that look like to you?
Thanks, Duncan. It's a bit daunting to go first up, but I think the easy answer and the best answer to tell the Deputy Vice Chancellor is we're already collaborating with those people. So through the BMC sleep team, we are already very multidisciplinary, so already collaborating with people in clinical trials and in neuroimaging and in new biomarkers for dementia and people in engineering and public health and health policy. So I think really for the breakthroughs, it needs to be not just a scientific breakthrough in thinking about how does sleep or circadian rhythm disturbance impact the brain, but what can we do about it? So we need to be thinking, I guess, from multiple lenses. How do we better measure it in the community? How do we better understand how sleep actually causes damage to the brain or fails to clear the brain overnight? How does that in turn impact on cognition and someone's ability to lay down their memories? And then what do we do about it? And even if we can do something about it, then how do we actually implement that into practice? So I think, we're very lucky at the University of Sydney because we've got so many talented people that we can bring together, and we've got a lot of interest in this area. It's been really hot since the discovery that sleep clears the brain of these key toxins that are involved in dementia. So that's a brief answer, but I'm aware we don't have much time, so I can expand more after everyone else has to go.
When I come back to you, I mean, I guess I'm really interested. I mean, I'm fascinated because, I'm a philosopher, so I basically don't know anything. So I love learning about all of your disciplines, but I guess I'm really also interested in where you think that sort of epistemological or methodological or perspectival shift is going to come from, and maybe that's something that's already happening. It'll be fascinating to get you talking a bit about that. Muireann, why don't we turn to you now? What's your take on what the next big development is in your area, and how does it relate to this sort of multidisciplinary approach in general?
Yeah, so I think, dementia is one of these huge problems that we can't solve without a multidisciplinary perspective. Basically, there is going to be no way that we can make these breakthroughs without teaming up, as Sharon said, with different people across multiple disciplines. So I think there's probably two issues to consider in terms of where we're going in the aging and neurodegeneration theme, and it relates to timescales. So one is talking about, the early detection, trying to get much more reliable and sensitive biomarkers to screen for who might be at risk and who is most likely to develop and progress. And the biomarker discovery will in turn, hopefully, lend itself towards therapeutics and the discovery of hopefully what we all hope is going to be a cure. And I think that in itself relies on a sort of a transdiagnostic approach. And we've heard from a number of different speakers over the last few days how we need to start moving beyond just thinking about clinical phenotypes and a diagnostic category and going more at a sort of transdiagnostic level in terms of mechanisms and what might be underlying mechanisms that are producing maybe different symptoms. And then in turn, we've got a more immediate problem, I think, in how do we actually respond and help those who are living with dementia right now while we wait for these developments to happen in terms of a cure. And again, I think there's huge scope for multidisciplinary collaboration to look at what has worked maybe in some other fields and see if we can translate that across.
Fantastic. Now, Sally, I'm sorry I didn't introduce you. I didn't have you on my list, but there you are in front of me. Great to have you with us as well. Maybe I'll hand over to you now to follow on from Muireann, from your perspective. I know you work in the sort of addiction and gambling area. So how do you see the next big development in your area, and maybe build on some of the things that Sharon and Muireann have said as well?
Yeah, I think that's right that traditionally behavioral addictions have been examined from a psychology point of view or potentially public health. But as we incorporate more technology and more everyday users into these activities, we're now starting to look broader at things like economics of risk taking, of payment mechanisms. How does the way people make payments online differ from cash-based payments? And as we're moving towards thinking about regulation, and there is a greater recognition of the public health burden of addictions, then how we look at things like legal and neuroethics to guide the line, a very fine line, which differs between societies and cultures, between paternalism and restrictions versus free will, informed choice. Do we use behavioral economic nudges as, options, or do we make it more of a stronger default strategy to start shaping behavior? As we learn more sophisticated ways to shape behavior, where is our responsibility in actually doing so? And then looking at similarly things like consumer marketing, how do we, once we develop effective treatments and strategies, encourage people to voluntarily take these up, being very directional, using that technology to really isolate and identify the people. So we're providing much more of a customized approach that's very tailored and individual, which is quite far removed from previous treatment approaches, which are kind of like you say, look at kind of a group of people, provide them all with the same thing. We can use technology to be much more nuanced in both the prevention and the treatment of addictive behaviours.
So it's fascinating where the technology is starting to put pressure on some really core concepts or ideas of individual autonomy and responsibility. It sort of goes both ways, doesn't it? I mean, usually those concepts are used to control the technology, right? We shouldn't do X because it violates a sense of personal autonomy or responsibility. Now the technology is saying, hey, you should change the way you think about your own agency or your own responsibility. So it's fascinating. So Sebastian, maybe I'll bring you in here because obviously this concept of mental wealth, a bit like Sally was suggesting, is starting to bridge, you know, I guess, broadly speaking, approaches to mental health and the social sciences and social policy more generally. So how do you see it from your perspective, the next big change or change of perspective in the areas that you're working in?
Thanks a lot, Duncan, and thanks for the invitation to fill in for Joe, to you and to Ian. So I guess if you think about what really matters to people with mental illness, then the issues really are about housing and employment and education and social participation. And unlike Sharon, unfortunately, Vice Chancellor, I've got to tell you that we aren't collaborating with those groups. At least I should say there is an exception. Ian is collaborating with them, and that's because Ian will talk to anybody, as you know, repeatedly and often quickly and in a loud voice. But generally speaking, the mental health sector has been, and particularly around services and funding and policy and so on, it's quite insular. And those bridges to those things which really matter to service users and their families are weak. So the kind of modelling that Ian presented on Joe's behalf this afternoon sits in a context whereby we're really looking to create a situation where we can exploit the capacity of individuals and communities for the greater mental wealth of the nation. So it fits in that context, and that is a really significant challenge from the more siloed approach that I think we've had to thinking about the way we research services, the way we deliver services, and the way we fund services. So I think that's the really big challenge, is to think more broadly outside that box and from the context, particularly of what matters to consumers and their families. Thanks, Duncan.
Yeah, thanks, Sebastian. So that engagement with families, Adam, was really a big part of your presentation that I just heard before. So, I mean, you have already spoken about in your presentation how important that multidisciplinary engagement is, but just thinking ahead, I mean, where do you think it's going to take the work that you're doing in relation to autism, and what do you think the big kind of necessary collaboration is going to be to progress the work in your field?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said so far, and building on Sharon's comment, you know, data is king at the moment in terms of what we're able to collect and how we're able to analyse it. And we can get data in ways that we've never been able to get before. So developing multidisciplinary ways of synthesising that in dimensional ways is a strength, but there's also a weakness in that, you know, there's never been such influence by social media and fast science. And we have to have science as a bastion of evidence-based practices to protect against some of these fast assumptions that are made in media. So I think there's a challenge there, and there's also a strength in that we can work together with families to deliver evidence-based practices, which is really important.
So just on that point of data, Michael, you know, you and I shared the stage for a fascinating evening. God, it seems like 10 years ago, talking about creativity and imagination and across science and the humanities and music and philosophy. It was quite a night. You're doing work with obviously people like Da-Cheng Tao and others in bringing computational, extraordinary computational power together with, your area. Where do you think the big breakthroughs are going to happen for you in that whole computational neuroscience area, and what's it going to look like in 10 years, do you think, if we get it right?
Thanks, Duncan. Yeah, I suppose my research is focused on using neuroimaging and the data embedded within it to solve problems for neurological disease, whether that's diagnosis, monitoring, or ultimately deriving sort of precision paradigms for individual treatment in individual patients. And without having a sort of multidisciplinary approach, the traditional clinicians sitting in a room seeing a patient obviously is not going to work. And the Brain and Mind Centre has given us the opportunity to bring together teams of people, clinicians, to ask those sort of questions, to pose the right questions, and then engineers, computer scientists, computational neuroscientists to help answer the questions, and using the tool that hasn't been mentioned so far, and that's artificial intelligence, and all of its sort of variations to sort of drive that work. And then the next step, of course, is when we create these new tools, these biomarkers using this data, then translating that into clinical trials. And that's where we have to expand our collaborations beyond just the laboratories across the university, but to involve industry, whether that's companies like NVIDIA or vendors like Siemens or GE. And then we also have to translate that to clinical trials and with the help of the pharmaceutical industry. But I suppose to sort of get back to your question about where I see the next big thing, I think I am a believer in artificial intelligence. I think it will drive the development of all of these novel biomarkers. I think one thing that we're recognizing is that it's not the whole answer. So computers and computational power are very good at doing some things, and humans are very good at doing some things. And I don't think I don't think one will ever replace the other. And probably, the future is having interfaces between human brain and computers that will really drive the next revolution in neurological disease. But I think we're a way off, at least my group is a way off from that, and we're going to focus our energy on neuroimaging and neuroscience with AI for the time being.
So look, it's a fascinating area, and we could spend the whole panel on it. Fabienne, neuroimmunology, obviously an incredibly exciting area, benefiting from a lot of exciting technological developments. How do you see the big changes or challenges in the next few years, and the way in which they're shaped by the multidisciplinary engagement that you've been having?
Yeah, so look, I agree about many things that we've said. I think for neuroimmunology, because over the last few years we have identified a lot of new diseases, and still the way of treating them is not known. So I do think diagnostic is a huge thing in neuroimmunology. We are multidisciplinary in nature because we mix neuroscience, neurology, and immunology, and those people don't usually talk together. So I think there's challenges there about open discussions and collaborations. I think we've done pretty well. But diagnostic is a big thing because at this time, many of those diseases are still diagnosed on biomarkers. And when we talk about diagnosis in Australia, we have to work with the regulator. Therefore, we need to partner with people whose job is to diagnose people. And of course, they are the pathology providers. And this is a very important step that we have to learn. We've been working alongside the pathology providers for many years, but not really with them because there was no need to. I think that is going to be a big thing and an important thing for people affected by neurological diseases.
Yeah, I mean, it is a kind of almost melancholy thought that we will become better and better at diagnosing diseases, but that will outpace our ability to treat them. It's a sort of very melancholy kind of consequence of scientific advance, isn't it? But I mean, it's a very powerful one as well. Okay, so we have so little time, and yet it's absolutely fascinating set of comments. So Ian, I'm going to come to you. And there is a question from our audience, which I want to get to as well. If there's any others, you might want to fire them up now before we have to close off. So Ian, just reflecting on the discussion up till now and what the colleagues have been talking about, I mean, looking at it from a kind of systematic perspective, from the mission and the aspiration of the Brain and Mind Centre, I mean, what has to happen over the next 5 to 10 years to take advantage of the kind of multidisciplinary momentum you guys have clearly built up, and that all of the colleagues here are seeing as central to their work and central to the future of their work. What's next for the BMC in that regard? What have you learned that you want to sort of push ahead? And I know it probably requires another $5 million from the DVCR, and the answer is no. But anyway, go for it.
Five. There's a zero missing there, Duncan. Five didn't pay anything. The right people. So generationally, I'm glad to feeling rather old sitting here at the moment. Other than Sebastian, I'm feeling like, it's the next generation of things, and that's critical. So I think one of the things is we've just got to encourage generationally people to exist in these multidisciplinary areas. I was saying this afternoon earlier on, I couldn't do any of the things I have done this year unless Joe Atkinson's team had moved in with a completely different set of skills that just happened to be exactly the right set of skills for the COVID period and highlighted a particular thing. Now, by contrast, she was also doing other work where she couldn't do what she was wanting to do in a contract way, working for a government agency, etc. We got to reconcile that supporting those team structures that allow people to really go. And I think, as Thomas Zutkov said earlier in the afternoon, go do work, Nobel Prize winner, go do things worth doing. I think we've got to convince people, young people, getting the opportunity, have structures that are large enough. In fact, my principal reason for coming to the University of Sydney at the time was it was large enough to let me do stuff that other people would never fund, right? We have to have stuff that's big enough to allow that experimentation and continuity. And for younger researchers at the moment within that team structure, focused on issues that society wants to solve. So think of that the overarching end, and we're really lucky. I think we see this very much in our general areas in child development, youth mental health and aging. Huge amount of societal interest in those areas. And yet there's a tremendous amount of, unknown unknowns in the areas. And there are, a tremendous amount we can only deal with by acting in that way, in a sustained way, and the continuous, I think, vigilance about what are the societal issues and who is most affected by those individuals. Now, I think on the other side of the coin, Duncan, and it just comes to the Q&A bit, I was going to say, when you said what's most important in the future, I was going to say the technology. So I actually think most of our methods, diagnostic methods, clinical trials methods, averaging methods, work not very well in medicine in general, which is headed towards personalisation, and almost don't work at all in the brain. That we are more different. So the heterogeneity within our processes by development and by variation is huge. What this is leading to worldwide, when part of things around ourselves, is the personalisation of data in huge consortia around the world, and we need to be part of that. But as Michael's alluding to, the analytical processes are difficult, the data governance issues are difficult, and then translating it back into individual benefit so that people benefit individually, not just on average, in particular ways. So I think we're going to see some really interesting disruptions to a lot of the focuses. You can see this year already disruption to the drug regulation process when faced with real need. Things change very quickly. The ways in which we had to adapt to the COVID situation. So I think, it's going to be very challenging, and we're going to need people who can work flexibly, people who can take big opportunities in particular, and then be supported by institutions. So I think the MDI thing, as you and I have discussed on many occasions, Duncan, is a fabulous opportunity here, and we are ahead of others in doing that. It's really challenging at the career level for people to have both deep disciplinary expertise, which they still need, but actually to have a perspective about how to apply that within bigger system sets of areas. So I think from the brain and mind point of view, the consolidation of that, or really becoming part of structures that can work with disciplinary expertise, but take it to another level. I think the personalisation in our areas actually won't rely on genetics and won't rely on a lot of other areas that medicine is pursuing. It will rely on deep phenotyping in particular areas that feeds the interventions back, or the preventions back at the individual level, and then counts those. So what Sebastian and I are tied up with is actually counting at an individual level, not on average, but on actually the degrees of improvement. And if it goes to social policy, it interacts with education, it interacts with child development, it interacts with other things that are happening at the moment. The transformation of child care to early childhood education, to other fundamental transformations going on. And just to give people encouragement, the sort of thing with the very large BHP grant that we've been able to attract at the end of the year is entirely based on that. They only want big transformative projects that have the capacity, but they're smart and they're different. They're not simply derivative of the individually disciplinary perspective. So I think, there are opportunities out there, and I think that's out of those types of opportunities, things that we don't expect will tend to be the transformative ones.
Yeah, and look, I think what everyone on this panel has demonstrated many times is the power of that vision for bringing together the strengths of different disciplines focused on a very hard, deep problem. It's something our partners love. It's something our government partners, our NGO partners, philanthropists, others, and I think the community more generally. I think, to me, that's a sort of social license to operate aspect of universities in the future. We have a kind of social, moral obligation to harness our resources in those ways. Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up. There's lots of interesting things. I mean, one really fascinating theme for me is the depth to which our disciplines and brain and science, brain and sort of mind sciences included, depend on data and depend on that integration with technology, and yet our culture is increasingly, you know, suffused with technology in all kinds of problematic ways. And I'm fascinated by how those two things can be sort of sit stably together, you know, but maybe that's another panel for next year. So look, thanks very much, everyone. There was one question, I just wanted to throw it out, like 30-second quick response. Matthew online has asked the panel's view on the efficacy of wearable technologies for mental health. Anybody want to have a quick response to that?
Big.
Big, there you go. That's the 3-word answer. Matthew, big. Okay, well, look, with that, I will thank you all